Darius checked his watch for the 10th time in as many minutes. 7:15 p.m. The corporate gala was in full swing, a symphony of clinking glasses, forced laughter, and the low hum of power brokering dressed up as casual conversation. He stood near a marble column, a ghost in a well-tailored but unremarkable suit, nursing a club soda with a lime wedge that had long since given up its zest. His real focus was miles away, in a stuffy school auditorium where his daughter, Maya, would soon be stepping onto a makeshift stage. She was playing the North Star in her third-grade play, a role she'd practiced for weeks, her lines echoing through their small apartment until they were as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. The curtain went up at 8 p.m. sharp. He had promised her, with a pinky swear that was more binding than any corporate contract, that he would be in the third row, center seat. He scanned the opulent ballroom of the downtown hotel, a sea of glittering gowns and bespoke tuxedos. This was the world of Sterling Vance Investments, a world he navigated with the precision of a minesweeper. For the past 5 years, he'd been a senior analyst here, a good one, respected for his sharp mind and meticulous reports. But he was also one of only a handful of black men on the executive track, and he understood the unspoken rules. Be twice as good, be unobtrusive, make no sudden moves, don't give anyone a reason to see you as anything other than a safe, reliable asset. He had built his life around this principle, a fortress of quiet competence designed to protect the one thing that mattered, his daughter. One wrong move, one misunderstanding, and the life he'd so carefully constructed for Maya could crumble. There was no margin for error. His late wife Angela had understood this landscape instinctively. You walk in a room and they see a story before you even open your mouth, she used to say, her hand warm on his arm. Your job, my love, is to make sure your story is so boringly excellent they have no choice but to listen to the words, not the noise. He missed her wisdom, that gentle anchor in the storm of his own anxieties. Now, he was the only one left to write that story, for himself and for Maya. He took a sip of his flat soda and his eyes drifted towards the head table, where the company's namesake and CEO, Elizabeth Vance, was holding court. She was a legend in their industry, a titan in a Chanel suit, her silver blonde hair pulled back in an impeccable chignon. She looked regal, untouchable, a marble statue of success. But Darius saw the faint tremors in her hand as she lifted her champagne flute, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes. The trade papers were full of whispers about her divorce, a brutal public affair with a real estate mogul who was apparently intent on dragging her through the mud. Just then, a commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. A man, impeccably dressed, but with a face contorted in a mask of fury, strode into the room. Richard Vale, Elizabeth's soon-to-be ex-husband. He made a beeline for the head table, his voice a low growl that silenced the orchestra. The air crackled with tension. Darius felt his own body tense up, his instincts screaming at him to fade further into the shadows of the column. This was the kind of drama you read about, not the kind you wanted to be anywhere near. Vale reached the table and leaned over, his words inaudible to the room, but their effect was devastating. Elizabeth Vance, the unflappable CEO, visibly flinched. Her face went pale, the carefully constructed mask of control shattering into a million pieces. He slammed a thin manila envelope onto the table in front of her and then turned, storming out as quickly as he had entered. A wave of whispers washed over the ballroom. Elizabeth sat frozen for a moment, the entire room's pity and curiosity boring into her. Then, with a jerky, uncoordinated movement, she stood up. She mumbled something to the person beside her and walked, not back towards the exit, but towards a side door leading to a service corridor. Her steps were unsteady. Darius watched her go, a knot tightening in his stomach. He saw not a CEO, but a woman utterly humiliated, stripped bare in front of her entire world. He thought of Angela, of her fierce belief in quiet dignity. He thought of Maya and the lessons he tried to teach her about kindness. His phone buzzed, a text from Mrs. Patterson, their elderly neighbor who was watching Maya until he got there. "Break a leg! Maya is so excited. We saved your seat." 7:30 p.m. He had to leave now if he was going to make it. He started for the main exit, his duty as a father pulling him away. But he couldn't shake the image of Elizabeth Vance's face. He hesitated, his feet rooted to the plush carpet. Every instinct for self-preservation told him to walk away. This was not his problem. Getting involved was a risk he couldn't afford. A black man and a powerful, distressed white woman in a vulnerable situation. The script for that story wrote itself, and it never ended well for the man who looked like him. But then another voice, a quieter one that sounded a lot like Angela's, whispered in his ear, "What kind of man are you, Darius? What kind of man do you want your daughter to see?" He turned away from the exit and walked towards the service door. He found her in the dimly lit corridor, slumped against the wall, her designer shoes kicked off beside her. An empty flask lay on the floor. The air was thick with the smell of expensive perfume and cheap whiskey. Her shoulders were shaking with silent sobs. He kept a respectful distance. "Miss Vance," he said softly. She didn't look up. "Are you all right?" She let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Never been better," she slurred, her voice thick and unfamiliar. She tried to push herself up, stumbled, and would have fallen if he hadn't reflexively stepped forward to steady her, his hands briefly touching her arms before he pulled back as if burned. "Let me call you a car," he offered, already pulling out his phone. "Or a friend." She shook her head, a violent negative motion. "No one. Can't let them see. Can't." He understood. The sharks in that ballroom would smell blood in the water. Weakness was a death sentence in their world. "Okay," he said, his mind racing. He couldn't just leave her here. It was a violation of a code so deep within him he didn't even have a name for it. He checked his watch again. 7:45 p.m. Maya's face flashed in his mind, her big brown eyes wide with anticipation. The North Star. His star. He felt a sharp, physical pain in his chest, the agony of a promise about to be broken. I'll take you home," he heard himself say, the words tasting like ash. "Just tell me your address." She mumbled something incoherent, her head lolling against the wall. She was in no condition to direct him anywhere. He looked at her, then at his watch. 7:50 p.m. The play was starting in 10 minutes. His heart hammered against his ribs. He made a choice. The kind of choice that defines a man for better or for worse. He took out his phone and dialed Mrs. Patterson. "Mrs. P," he said, his voice strained. "Something's come up at work. An emergency. I'm going to be late. Very late." He could hear the disappointment in the silence on the other end of the line. "Oh, Darius." Maya was so looking forward to... "I know," he cut her off, the guilt of physical weight. "Please, can you record it for me? Tell her I love her, and I'm so sorry." He helped Elizabeth to her feet, her weight surprisingly heavy against him. He guided her through a series of back hallways, away from prying eyes, and out to the valet. He gave the attendant his ticket for his modest sedan, a car that felt wholly out of place among the Bentleys and Teslas. He managed to get her into the passenger seat, her head slumping against the window. As he drove away from the glittering hotel and towards his own quiet neighborhood in Queens, he felt a profound sense of dread. He had missed his daughter's moment of triumph. He was driving his drunk, powerful CEO to his home because he didn't know what else to do. He only did the right thing. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the next morning, when she woke up in a strange house, one phone call could change everything. For a black man, a single father, there's no room for misunderstanding. The weight of his decision settled over him, heavy and cold as a shroud. He had chosen to help, but in doing so, he may have just destroyed the very life he was trying so desperately to protect. The drive to his apartment was a blur of streetlights and rising panic. Elizabeth was mostly silent, occasionally mumbling fragments of sentences that made no sense. He carried her purse, a ridiculously expensive leather bag that probably cost more than his monthly mortgage payment. Inside, her phone was buzzing incessantly, but he didn't dare answer it. He parked in his designated spot behind the 3-story brick building, the familiar sight of home offering no comfort tonight. The real challenge was getting her up the 2 flights of stairs. He half-carried, half-guided her, his arm wrapped firmly around her waist, her arm slung over his shoulder. The scent of her perfume was dizzying. He was acutely aware of every point of contact, every brush of her hand against his neck. He moved with a mechanical precision, his mind a fortress of neutrality. This is a problem to be solved, a person in need, nothing more. He fumbled with his keys, finally getting the door open and leading her into the quiet darkness of his apartment. The first thing he did was flick on a small lamp in the living room. The space was tidy, lived in. A stack of Maya's library books sat on the coffee table next to a half-finished drawing of a smiling sun. A worn, comfortable armchair, Angela's favorite, sat in the corner. For a moment, he saw the scene through Elizabeth's eyes, if she were lucid. The modesty of it all, the sheer ordinariness, must be a world away from her polished, curated life. He didn't know where to put her. The couch, his bed. Both options felt wrong, loaded with implications he couldn't afford. Then he remembered Maya's room. It was the one sanctuary in the house, a space of pure innocence. He guided Elizabeth down the short hallway and into the room. It was painted a soft yellow, with glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to the ceiling. A menagerie of stuffed animals was piled on her small twin bed. On the nightstand, a framed photo showed a younger Darius and a radiant Angela holding a baby Maya. He carefully helped Elizabeth sit on the edge of the bed. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused. I'm going to get you some water," he said, backing out of the room slowly, as if leaving a wild animal's den. In the kitchen, he leaned against the counter, his breath coming in ragged gasps. What had he done? He had brought his boss, the CEO of his company, into his daughter's bedroom. He ran a hand over his face, the exhaustion of the long day, the longer night, crashing down on him. He filled a glass with water and found a bottle of aspirin in the medicine cabinet. When he returned to Maya's room, Elizabeth had curled up on the bed, on top of the unicorn print comforter, still in her silk evening gown. She was fast asleep. Her breathing was deep and even. He placed the water and aspirin on the nightstand, then gently removed her high heels, setting them neatly on the floor beside the bed. He pulled a spare blanket from the closet and draped it over her, careful not to touch her more than necessary. He stood there for a long time, looking at this powerful woman reduced to such a vulnerable state. The room was filled with the quiet energy of his daughter, her drawings taped to the walls, her scent on the pillows. It felt like a sacred space, and her presence in it felt like a desecration. He backed out and softly closed the door, leaving it cracked just an inch. He walked back to the living room and sank onto his own couch, the springs groaning in protest. He didn't bother changing out of his suit. Sleep was an impossibility. He just sat in the dim light, his mind replaying the evening's events over and over. Every choice, every action, was now a potential piece of evidence in a trial that hadn't even begun. He imagined the questions, the accusations. Why did you bring her to your apartment? Why not take her to a hotel? Why was she in your daughter's bed? He had answers, of course, good, logical, honorable answers, but he knew that in the court of opinion, especially when race and power were involved, the truth was often the weakest defense. Hours passed. The city outside grew quiet. He must have dozed off, because he was startled awake by the sound of his front door opening. It was Mrs. Patterson, her face etched with concern. She was holding his apartment key, the one he'd given her for emergencies. "Darius, I was so worried. I saw your car. Is everything all right?" she whispered, her eyes darting around the room. He put a finger to his lips, his heart pounding. "It's complicated, Mrs. P. Please, keep your voice down." He quickly and quietly explained the situation in clipped, vague terms. A colleague from work had a personal emergency, was unwell, and he had to help. He left out the part about her being the CEO. Her expression softened with understanding, though her eyes were still full of questions. "Ah, you poor dear, always carrying the world on your shoulders." She handed him her phone. "Maya was wonderful, a true star. She was so brave, even though you weren't there." She had recorded the entire play. He took the phone, his hands trembling slightly. Did you tell her?" he asked, his voice cracking. "I told her you had to help someone who was very sad, and that being kind was sometimes more important than being on time. I told her you loved her more than all the stars in the sky." He felt a wave of gratitude so immense it almost brought him to his knees. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. I don't know what I'd do without you." She patted his arm. "You're a good man, Darius. A good father. Don't you ever forget that." She left as quietly as she came, leaving him alone again in the charged silence of his apartment. He couldn't bring himself to watch the video. Not yet. The guilt was too raw. Instead, he stared at the closed bedroom door, behind which slept a woman who held his entire future in her hands. He thought about Angela and what she would have done. She would have made tea. She would have found a way to bring grace to an impossible situation. He couldn't manage grace. All he could manage was a silent, desperate prayer that the morning would bring clarity and not destruction. The first grey light of dawn began to creep through the blinds, signaling the end of his long, dark night of the soul. Soon, she would wake up, and the real crisis would begin. The sound came around 6:30 a.m., a soft groan from down the hallway, followed by the rustle of fabric. Darius, who had been sitting bolt upright on the couch for the last hour, felt his entire body go rigid. He heard the creak of the bedroom door opening. He didn't move. He just listened, his senses on high alert. He heard her footsteps, hesitant on the hardwood floor of the hallway. He heard her sharp intake of breath as she entered the living room and saw him, sitting there in his rumpled suit from the night before. He finally looked up and met her gaze. Elizabeth Vance stood in the doorway of his living room, clutching the blanket he'd given her. Her hair was a mess, her makeup was smudged, and her eyes were wide with a mixture of confusion and fear. She looked at him. Then her eyes darted around the unfamiliar apartment, taking in the family photos on the wall, the stack of bills on the small desk, the profound, uncorporate reality of his life. Her gaze fell to her own body, and she seemed to see for the first time that she was still in her evening gown. A flicker of panic crossed her face. She looked down at her feet, bare on his floor, her expensive heels nowhere in sight. Where am I?" she asked, her voice a raw whisper. "Whose house is this?" Her eyes narrowed, the confusion hardening into suspicion. "Who are you?" He knew this was the critical moment. His response now would set the tone for everything that followed. He rose slowly from the couch, keeping his hands open and visible at his sides. He maintained a careful, neutral distance. "My name is Darius Moore. I work in the analytics department at Sterling Vance," he said, his voice calm and steady, betraying none of the terror churning in his gut. "You were unwell last night at the gala. I brought you here. This is my apartment." Her eyes scanned his face, searching for a name, a memory. He could see the moment of vague recognition dawned. He was just one of the dozens of faces she saw in meetings, a name on a report, a nobody. The fact that she was here, in a nobody's apartment, seemed to deepen her alarm. She took a step back, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. "Unwell?" she repeated, the word dripping with disbelief. "What happened? I don't remember anything after Richard showed up." Her hand instinctively went to her purse, which he had placed on the coffee table. She snatched it up, her fingers fumbling with the clasp. She pulled out her phone, her thumb swiping frantically across the screen. This was it, the moment he had been dreading. He stood perfectly still, his back against the wall, a silent defendant in a courtroom of her own making. He knew how this would play out. A black man, his drunk, powerful white boss, in his house. It didn't matter what actually happened. The narrative was too powerful, too ingrained in the fabric of society. He watched as she found the contact she was looking for, her finger hovering over the screen. He could almost hear the conversation that was about to happen. "I woke up in some man's apartment. One of my employees. I don't know how I got here. I don't remember anything." Her voice when she spoke into the phone was raw and terrified. "Rachel, it's me. Listen to me. Something's happened." She turned her back to him, pacing the small living room like a caged animal. I don't know where I am. I woke up in someone's house, a man's house." A long pause. Darius could hear the tinny, frantic questions from the other end of the line. "No, I don't think so. I'm wearing my dress from last night." She stopped pacing and her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "He's here, in the room." Darius closed his eyes. He felt the floor drop out from under him. Every fear he had ever had about being misunderstood, about being seen as a threat, was coalescing in this single, horrifying moment. He could lose his job. He could lose his reputation. In the worst-case scenario, a scenario that was all too plausible, he could lose his daughter. "His name is Darius Moore," she said into the phone, and the sound of his own name being spoken as part of a potential accusation was like a physical blow. "He works for me. Analytics." Another pause. She listened intently to the voice on the other end. He saw her shoulders tense. The lawyer, Rachel, was likely painting a grim picture, advising caution, telling her not to say anything, to leave immediately, to call the police. He braced himself. But then, something shifted. Elizabeth stopped talking and started looking. Really looking. Her eyes fell on the half-finished drawing on the coffee table. It was a crayon portrait of him and Maya, holding hands under a giant, smiling sun. The sun was wearing a sparkly party hat. Maya had labeled it, "Me and Daddy, the best team." Her gaze then drifted to the bookshelf, filled not with impressive hardbacks, but with worn paperbacks and a whole shelf dedicated to children's books. Her eyes landed on the framed photos on the mantelpiece. Him and Angela on their wedding day, Maya's first day of school, a family trip to the beach, Angela's arm thrown around his shoulders, both of them laughing, alive and happy. The story of his life was written on the walls of that room, a story of love and loss and fatherhood. It was a story that was profoundly at odds with the one her friend was likely whispering in her ear. She walked slowly towards the hallway, her bare feet silent on the wood floor. She peeked into the room where she had slept, Maya's room. She saw the unicorn comforter, the stuffed animals, the photo of the smiling family on the nightstand next to the glass of water and the aspirin he had left for her. She saw her own designer heels placed neatly on the floor. Her eyes lingered on a drawing taped to the wall, a newer one. It showed a little girl in a star costume, standing on a stage. Underneath, in a child's careful printing, it said, "For Daddy, my biggest fan. Love, Maya." And next to the date, which was yesterday's, was a small, sad face. The weight of what that little drawing represented seemed to land on her. She turned and looked back at Darius, who hadn't moved from his spot by the wall. The suspicion in her eyes was slowly being replaced by something else. A dawning, horrified understanding. She brought the phone back to her ear. "Rachel," she said, and her voice was different now. Clearer, steadier. "Rachel, I need you to listen to me. Stop talking." She took a deep breath. "Nothing happened. He helped me." She walked back into the living room. Her eyes locked on Darius's. He found me at the gala. I was a mess. He brought me here because I couldn't tell him where I lived." She sank onto the edge of the armchair. Angela's chair. "He has a daughter, Rachel. Her name is Maya." Her voice broke on the name. "Last night was her school play. He missed it. He missed his daughter's play because he was here, making sure I was safe." She looked around the small, tidy room, at the evidence of a life lived with care and love. "He slept on the couch," she said, the words barely a whisper. He slept on the couch all night. Darius felt the massive, crushing weight on his chest lift, just slightly. Just enough to let him breathe again. He had been judged, and for once, the verdict was based on the evidence of his character, not the color of his skin. He watched as Elizabeth ended the call. She sat in silence for a long moment, her head in her hands. The formidable CEO was gone, replaced by a woman who looked tired and fragile and profoundly ashamed. The crisis had peaked, and in its wake, an uncomfortable, uncertain quiet remained. The threat of accusation had passed, but the consequences of that night were still hanging in the air, unwritten. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Elizabeth finally looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but clear for the first time. "I am so sorry," she said, and the words were not a corporate platitude. They were heavy with genuine remorse. For the phone call, for the suspicion, for everything. Darius gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He was still processing the whiplash of the last 10 minutes, the terrifying proximity to ruin. "You were confused. You didn't know where you were," he said, his voice raspy. It was an offering of grace he wasn't sure she deserved, but it was the only way he knew how to be. "That's not an excuse," she said, shaking her head. "My friend." She immediately went to the worst-case scenario, and for a minute I let her. I let my fear and my own prejudices paint a picture that is unforgivable. She gestured around the room. "This picture," she said, her voice soft, "tells a very different story." She stood up and walked over to the drawing of the girl in the star costume. "Maya," she said again. "She was a star in her play last night." Darius finally allowed himself to move, to walk over to the small desk where Mrs. Patterson's phone lay. He picked it up, his hand still not entirely steady. "Her teacher said she was the best North Star they've ever had," he said, a swell of pride momentarily eclipsing the exhaustion. He unlocked the phone and found the video file. Without a word, he handed it to Elizabeth. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and sank back into the armchair. He went into the kitchen to make coffee, needing the simple, mechanical task to ground himself. As the coffee maker gurgled to life, he could hear the faint sound of the video playing in the other room. He heard the off-key piano introduction, the shuffling of little feet on a wooden stage, and then a clear, sweet voice. Maya's voice. He leaned against the counter, closing his eyes, listening to the lines he knew by heart. He heard the scattered applause from the audience of parents. He heard Maya's solo part, the one she was so nervous about, delivered with a confidence that made his heart ache. He brought 2 mugs of black coffee into the living room. Elizabeth was sitting exactly where he had left her, her eyes glued to the small screen. Tears were streaming silently down her face, dripping onto the silk of her ruined dress. She wasn't just watching a school play. She was witnessing the sacrifice he had made. The video showed the final bows, the children beaming under the hot stage lights. And then, Mrs. Patterson's shaky camera panned across the audience, searching, before zooming in on the empty seat in the third row, the one with a handmade, "Reserved for Daddy" sign placed on it. Elizabeth let out a small, choked sob at the sight of it. The video ended. She looked up at him, her face a mask of raw emotion. "You did this for me?" she asked, her voice thick with disbelief. "You missed that for me? A woman who has been nothing but a name on a letterhead to you?" Darius sat down on the couch opposite her, placing her mug on the coffee table. He took a slow sip of his own. "You needed help," he said simply, as if that explained everything. And in his world it did. It was the code Angela had lived by, the code he was trying to instill in Maya. You show up for people. Period. No one else was going to step up. And I couldn't just walk away. Anyone else would have, she said, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. They would have called security, or my assistant. They would have protected themselves. But you protected me. At your own expense. At your daughter's expense. She shook her head, a look of profound self-awareness on her face. I spend my days in boardrooms, moving millions of dollars around, making decisions that affect thousands of people. I thought that was strength. I thought that was power. She looked at the family photos on his mantle. I was wrong. This, she said, gesturing to the room, to the life he had built, is strength. A comfortable silence fell between them, the first of its kind. The coffee was hot, the morning sun was now streaming through the windows, and the immediate danger had passed. But something new was taking its place. An understanding, a connection forged in the crucible of a terrible night. I need to get home, she said finally, and I need to make this right. Darius knew what that phrase meant in her world. It meant money, a promotion, a bonus, a transactional solution to an emotional problem. There's nothing to make right, Miss Vance, he said, his voice firm but respectful. I would just appreciate it if this situation remained between us. She looked at him, really seeing him now, not as an employee, not as a potential threat, but as a man of quiet, unshakable integrity. First, she said, call me Elizabeth, and second, discretion is the least I owe you, but that's not enough. She stood up, her posture regaining some of its familiar authority, but her eyes held a new softness, a new humility. I need a change of clothes, she said, looking down at her rumpled gown, and then I need you to let me thank you properly. He hesitated. The idea of accepting anything from her felt complicated, like it would taint the purity of his choice. He had acted not for reward, but because it was the right thing to do. I have a few of my wife's things still, he said quietly, the words catching in his throat. In the back of the closet. She was about your size. He led her to his own bedroom, a simple, Spartan room, and opened the closet. In the back, tucked away in a garment bag, were a few of Angela's dresses. He unzipped the bag and pulled out a simple, practical wrap dress. He handed it to her, along with a fresh towel. The bathroom is just there, he said, pointing. I'll wait in the living room. As he turned to leave, she spoke his name. Darius. He stopped. Her picture is in your daughter's room, she said softly. She was beautiful. He simply nodded, unable to speak, and retreated to the living room, the ghost of his wife's presence now filling the small apartment, along with everything else. While she was in the bathroom, he finally sat down to watch the video of Maya's play for himself. He watched it from the beginning, his heart swelling with a painful mix of pride and regret. He saw her searching the audience for his face, the flicker of disappointment, and then the brave little smile she put on as she took her place on stage. He saw her deliver her lines with passion, her small body radiating confidence. She was his North Star, in every sense of the word, and he had let her down. The guilt he had been holding at bay all night washed over him completely. He put his head in his hands, the silent tears he had refused to shed finally coming. He wasn't crying because of the risk he had taken or the fear he had felt. He was crying for that empty chair in the third row. Elizabeth emerged from the hallway a few minutes later, dressed in Angela's dress. The simple floral fabric was a stark contrast to the Chanel power suits she usually wore, but it suited her. It made her look softer, more human. She had washed her face and tied her hair back with a rubber band she must have found in the bathroom. She saw him crying, and for a moment she looked like she was going to retreat, to give him his privacy. But then she did something unexpected. She walked over and sat on the couch. Not too close, but not far away either. She didn't say anything. She just sat with him in his grief, a quiet, supportive presence. It was a gesture of profound respect, a way of being with him in his vulnerability, without trying to fix it. In that moment, the chasm of race, class, and power that separated them seemed to disappear entirely, replaced by a shared, fragile humanity. After a few moments, he composed himself, wiping his eyes on his sleeve. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, embarrassed. "It's just, I never break a promise to her." Elizabeth looked at him, her expression full of a kind of awe. "You didn't break your promise, Darius," she said softly. "You just kept a different one, a harder one." She picked up the crayon drawing from the coffee table, the one of him and Maya. "She knows you're the best team. That's all that matters." He looked at the drawing, at the smiling sun with the party hat, and for the first time since the previous night he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she was right. Maybe his daughter, in her infinite 9-year-old wisdom, would understand. "I'll call a car," she said, pulling out her phone. While she arranged her ride, Darius went to Maya's room. He straightened the unicorn comforter and plumped the pillows. He picked up Maya's star costume, which was lying on a chair, and folded it carefully. He was trying to erase any sign of the night's intrusion, to restore the sanctity of his daughter's space. When he came back out, Elizabeth was standing by the door, her own purse in one hand, her expensive heels in the other. "My car will be here in 5 minutes," she said. The awkwardness of departure hung between them. "The dress," he started, not sure what the protocol was. I'll have it dry cleaned and returned," she said quickly. "Thank you." An idea then occurred to her, a thought that brought a genuine, unforced smile to her face for the first time. "Actually, may I borrow it for a little while?" He looked at her, confused. "I have a board meeting this afternoon," she explained. "A room full of men who watched Richard humiliate me last night. They expect me to come in wearing armor. I think I'd rather come in wearing this, to remind me what real strength looks like." He was taken aback by the sentiment, by the depth of her transformation. He simply nodded. "Okay." Her car arrived, a sleek black town car that looked as out of place in his neighborhood as he had felt at the gala. As she opened the door to leave, she paused and turned back to him. "Darius," she said, her voice serious. "What happened last night, the risk you took, I understand what that meant. I understand that for you. The stakes are different. Higher. I want you to know that I see that. I see you." It was the most profound thing anyone in his corporate life had ever said to him. To be seen, not as a statistic, a diversity hire, or a potential threat, but as a man, a father, a person of character. It was a gift more valuable than any promotion. "Thank you, Elizabeth," he said, and for the first time, he used her name. She gave him a small, grateful smile, and then she was gone. He closed the door and leaned against it, the quiet of his apartment settling back in. It was over. He had navigated the minefield, and come out the other side. Not just unscathed, but understood. He looked around the living room, which now felt different, charged with the memory of the last 12 hours. He knew that nothing would be quite the same again. His carefully constructed wall of invisibility had been breached. He had taken a risk, a monumental one, and it had led not to disaster, but to a strange and unexpected redemption. He picked up his keys. It was time to go pick up his daughter from Mrs. Patterson's and try to explain the unexplainable. He could only hope that his North Star would guide him through that conversation too. He found Maya at Mrs. Patterson's kitchen table, meticulously coloring in a picture of a galaxy. She didn't look up when he came in, a sure sign that she was upset. Mrs. Patterson gave him a sympathetic look over the top of her reading glasses and discreetly left the room. Darius pulled up a chair beside his daughter. The silence was thick with unspoken disappointment. "Hey, superstar," he said softly. She continued to color, pressing down hard with a purple crayon. "I saw the video," he continued. "You were amazing. You lit up the whole stage." "You weren't there," she said, her voice small and tight, her eyes still fixed on the paper. The words were a direct hit to his heart. "I know, sweetie, and I am more sorry than I can say." He reached out to touch her shoulder, but she flinched away. "Mrs. Patterson said you had to help someone who was sad," she said, finally looking up at him. Her big brown eyes, so much like her mother's, were swimming with confusion and hurt. "Was she sadder than me?" Out of the mouths of babes came the questions that could level a man. How could he explain the complexities of adult desperation, of public humiliation, of the moral imperative that had driven him? He couldn't. So he told her the simplest, most honest version of the truth. "The person I was helping, she was very alone," he said carefully. "She was in a situation where she was not safe, and there was no one else. Sometimes, Maya, we have to make a hard choice. My heart was right there with you, in that auditorium, in that empty seat. But my body had to be somewhere else, making sure someone was safe. Your mum, she always taught me that was the most important thing, to show up when people need you." He saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes. He had invoked the sacred memory of her mother, the ultimate authority on kindness in their small family. "Mommy would have helped her too?" she asked. "Without a doubt," he confirmed. "She would have been the first one there." Maya seemed to consider this for a long moment. She picked up a yellow crayon, the color of her star costume. "Okay," she said quietly. She went back to her coloring, but the tension in her small shoulders had eased. She hadn't forgiven him completely. Not yet, but she had opened the door. She was trying to understand. He knew then that their team, the best team, would be okay. The next week at work was strange. He walked through the halls of Sterling Vance waiting for the other shoe to drop, but nothing happened. No strange looks, no whispers, no summons to HR. It was as if the night of the gala had never occurred. The only difference was Elizabeth. She had always been a remote, intimidating figure, seen only in large meetings or striding down the hallway, surrounded by a phalanx of executives. Now he saw her differently. One afternoon, he was in the company cafeteria when she walked in with her entourage. Their eyes met across the room. He gave her a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She returned it with a small, genuine smile that was meant only for him. It was a silent acknowledgement of their shared secret, a bond forged in crisis. Later that day, an email arrived in his inbox. It was from her. The subject line was simply, "Thank you." The body of the email was short. "There is a re-performance of the third grade play for the school board next Tuesday at 4 p.m. I've cleared your calendar, and I've cleared mine. I would be honored to be your guest, if you'll have me." Attached was not a file, but a simple, digitally drawn, smiley face. Darius stared at the email, a slow smile spreading across his own face. This was her way of making it right. Not with money, but with presence. It was a gesture of such profound understanding that it moved him more than any bonus could have. He typed back a simple reply. "We'd love that. Third row, center." The following Tuesday, he left work at 3 p.m., walking out of the building with a confidence he hadn't felt before. He met Maya at her school, and her face lit up when she saw him. "You're early," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around his waist. "I am," he said, hugging her tight. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." Just as they were about to head into the auditorium, a black town car pulled up to the curb. Elizabeth stepped out. She was not wearing a power suit. She was wearing a simple pair of slacks and a soft cashmere sweater. In her hands, she held a small bouquet of yellow flowers, the color of a star. Maya looked from Elizabeth to her father, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Daddy, who's that?" Darius smiled. "Maya, this is my boss, Elizabeth. She wanted to come see the famous North Star for herself." Elizabeth knelt down so she was at eye level with Maya. "I heard so much about your performance," she said, her voice warm and gentle. "I brought you these, for being such a star." Maya took the flowers, her initial shyness melting away. "Thank you," she said. "Are you the sad lady Daddy had to help?" Elizabeth's smile wavered for a fraction of a second, but she recovered gracefully. "I was," she said honestly, "but your daddy helped me not be sad anymore. He's a very kind man." They walked into the auditorium together, an unlikely trio. Darius, the devoted father who had learned to be visible. Elizabeth, the powerful CEO who had learned the value of presence. And Maya, the little girl who had taught them both something about forgiveness and unconditional love. They found their seats, third row, center. Elizabeth sat next to Darius, and when the lights went down, he saw her reach into her purse and pull out her phone, not to check emails, but to record the play, just in case. As Maya took the stage, she looked out into the audience. She saw her father, his face beaming with pride, and next to him, she saw the woman he had helped, her face full of a quiet, respectful attention. Maya smiled, a brilliant, radiant smile, and delivered her opening line, her voice clear and strong, filling the small room with light. Darius watched her, his heart so full he thought it might burst. For years, he had lived his life trying to be invisible, trying to avoid mistakes, trying to never give anyone a reason to question his character. But that night, he had made a different choice, a dangerous choice, and somehow, against all odds, it had led him here, to this moment of simple, profound grace. Maybe the world wasn't fair, maybe it never would be. But he had learned that character wasn't built in the spotlight. It was built in the small, hard choices when no one was watching. And sometimes, if you were very, very lucky, there was someone there to see you for who you really were. And maybe that was enough. Darius's story reminds us that integrity isn't about grand gestures. It's about the quiet decisions made in difficult moments. If this story of an everyday hero moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of resilience and character. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. What does being a good person mean to you in today's world?